Hello and welcome. My name is Alan. Today we're going to talk a bit about pay, wages. Uh, During FDR's tenure as president, he made a number of things. He had to fight through the Great Depression and World War II. And one of the things he presented in his 1944 State of the Union speech was he called it a second Bill of Rights, a form of economic stability for the people. But we're going to take a look at this. But yeah, you can see this. I'll have it posted in the link below the video in the description box. But it's on the channel Kill Will 3. Among, I'm sure others probably have it as well.
In our day, certain economic proofs have become accepted as self-evident. A second Bill of Rights, under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station or race or creed. Among these are the right to a useful and remunerative job, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, the right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return which will give him and his family a decent living, the right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom, freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad, the right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care, and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment, the right to a good education. All of these rights spell security. And after this war is won, we must be prepared to move forward in the implementation of these rights to new goals of human happiness and well-being. For unless there is security here at home, there cannot be lasting peace in the world.
But yeah, we'll go ahead and give the channel a like for the video. Anyway, as we can see, he was like, look, there are certain economic needs and ideas that we must absolutely pursue to have a better nation. To go forward as a civilized country, we must guarantee certain things. We can see it in other first world countries. Yet here in the U.S., we are still without. And they keep feeding us these little lies of, oh, we can't afford it. Oh, what would it do to those who went without? You do things to present a better future. Period. You know, a great man doesn't live necessarily to see mighty oaks spring up to great heights. He's just there to plant the seeds and the seedlings, to get them started. And you have to start somewhere. At some point, Now this is from Wikipedia, talking about the Second Bill of Rights. And of course they have pretty much what I showed here, the Second Bill of Rights speech he just gave. But yeah. Proposed by U.S. President FDR during his State of the Union speech, January 11th, 1944. Roosevelt suggested the nation had come to recognize and show how should now implement a second Bill of Rights, and argued that the political rights guaranteed by the Constitution and the original Bill of Rights had proved inadequate to assure the equality in the pursuit of happiness. His remedy was to declare an economic Bill of Rights, the Second Bill of Rights, to guarantee these specific rights. Guarantee you have some kind of employment. You have a right to make a living. You should be able to have an income for food, shelter, and recreation. It should supply you with all. You know, the American dream of the 1950s and 60s. That was robbed from so many of us. Farmers' rights to a fair income. Many small farmers are just struggling, and Trump's only made it worse. But they have a right to grow, sustain, and harvest crops and other goods that would sustain them, safely sustain them. Freedom from unfair competition and monopolies. Regulate these giant fucking businesses. Decent housing. I absolutely agree. Everyone should have a right to some form of housing, some form of shelter, and it shouldn't just be a little tent. No, I'm talking a decent house. Somewhere with a bed. Somewhere you can cook your meals. And be able to use a restroom and take a shower, bathe in whatever fashion you wish. Duh. These are common sense things. Adequate medical care. Absolutely. We should have health care, and it shouldn't put us in the poorhouse. We're still fighting for this. Social Security. We've got a program like that to help make sure those in their later parts of life, or those who struggle with health and so on, are able to maintain a living, a life. Education. Again, you should be able to further your education without being put into ridiculous debt and the poorhouse. Yeah, economic rights. Though they would not be enshrined within the Constitution, the hope of advocating the policy was that it would be encoded and guaranteed by federal law. Of course, however, yeah, that wouldn't necessarily come to be. Roosevelt stated that having such rights would guarantee American security and that the U.S. place in the world depended on how far the rights had been carried into practice. This particular safety had been described as a state of physical welfare, as well as economic security, social security, and moral security by American legal scholar Cass Sunstein. Roosevelt pursued a legislative agenda to enact his second Bill of Rights by lending executive branch personnel to key Senate committees. This tactic, effectively a blending of powers, produced mixed results and generated a backlash from Congress, which resulted in the passage of the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1946. After World War II and Roosevelt had passed away, this act provided funding for Congress to establish its own staffing for committees. But yeah. So, this idea is not a new thing. We know there's a want to have a better life for everybody. After Roosevelt's death in 1945, Harry Truman's administration had, within a few years, compromised the New Deal, FDR's big economic plan that drug us out of the Great Depression. FDR's third-term vice president, Henry Wallace, launched a presidential bid in 1948 with a new party. The Progressive Party platform promoted the opposition party's abandoned Economic Bill of Rights. 1960, the DNC at the Democratic National Convention, the party nominated John F. Kennedy for president and Lyndon Johnson for vice president. In the platform, it endorsed the Economic Bill of Rights, and civil rights leader MLK, champion of economic justice long before the historic 1963 March on Washington, lobbied for the Economic Bill of Rights in a 1968 Look magazine essay published after his assassination. Key civil rights movement activist A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin in 1966 drafted a freedom budget for all Americans. Yeah. Like I said, several times this has been pushed for. 2004, legal scholar Cass Sunstein called for a revival of FDR's unfulfilled vision in his book, The Second Bill of Rights, FDR's Unfinished Revolution and Why We Need It More Than Ever. Fall 2009, Michael Moore's Capitalism, a Love Story, introduced the Second Bill of Rights to moviegoers and generated national and even international press. In his 2020 presidential primary campaign, Senator Bernie Sanders promoted a 21st century Bill of Rights. 2022, Professor Harvey J. Kaye and Alan Minsky of Progressive Democrats of America launched a campaign for a modern, expanded 21st century Bill of Rights. At its 2022 convention, the Massachusetts Democratic Party endorsed the PDA proposal. And in 2024, Marianne Williamson featured the 21st Century Economic Bill of Rights in her platform in her run for president. So yeah, this is something It's not a new idea, and honestly, it should have already been established. Yet, yet, we still slave away at the bare bones just to try to live. This is from departmentoflabor.gov, a history of changes to the minimum wage law. Adapted from minimum wage and maximum hours standard under the Fair Labor Standards Act, a 1988 report to Congress under Section 4D1 of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Early in the administration of the FLSA, it became apparent that application of the statutory minimum wage was likely to produce undesirable effects upon the economies of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands if applied to all of their covered industries. Remember, they were at that point and still are to this day U.S. territories. Consequently, on June the 26th, 1940, an amendment was enacted prescribing the establishment of special industry committees to determine and issue through wage orders the minimum wage levels applicable in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. The rates established the industry committees could be less than the statutory rates applicable elsewhere in the U.S. On May the 14th, 1947, the Fair Labor Standards Act was amended by the Portal to Portal Act, and this legislation was significant because it resolved some issues as to what constitutes compensable hours worked under the FLSA. Matters involving underground travel in coal mines and make-ready practices in factories had been decided earlier in a number of U.S. Supreme Court decisions. Subsequent amendments to the FLSA have extended the law's coverage to additional employees and raised the level of the minimum wage. 1949, the minimum wage was raised from 40 cents an hour to 75 cents an hour for all workers, and the minimum wage coverage was expanded to include workers in the airport industry. So, 49, we go from a minimum of 40 cents to 75 cents. The 1949 amendments also eliminated industry committees except in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. A specific section was added granting the Wage and Hour Administrator in the U.S. Department of Labor authorization to control the incidence of exploitative industrial homework. A 1955 amendment increased the minimum wage to $1 an hour with no changes in coverage. 49 to 55, 55, we go from 75 cents to $1. The 1961 amendments, 55 to 61, greatly expanded the FLSA scope in the retail sector and increased the minimum for previously covered workers to $1.15 an hour effective September 1961, and then again to $1.25 an hour in September 1963. See, at this point, it's about 5-6 years. Boom, boom, boom. The next raise. So yeah, pay attention to this. The minimum for workers newly subject to the act was set at $1 an hour effective September 1961, and $1.15 an hour in September 1964, and $1.25 an hour in September 1965. Retail and service establishments were allowed to deploy full-time students at wages of no more than 15% below the maximum or below the minimum, with proper certification from the Department of Labor. The amendments extended coverage to employees of retail trade enterprises with sales exceeding $1 million annually, although individual establishments within those covered enterprises were exempt if their annual sales fell below $250,000. The concept of enterprise coverage was introduced by the 1961 amendments, and they extended coverage in the retail trade industry from an established 250,000 workers to 2.2 million. Congress further broadened coverage with amendments in 1966, so 61 to 66, by lowering the enterprise sales volume test from 500,000 effective February 1967, with a further cut to 250,000 effective February 1969. The 66 amendments also extended coverage to public schools, nursing homes, laundries, and an entire construction industry. Farms were subject to coverage for the first time if their employment reached 500 or more man days of labor in the previous year's peak quarter. The minimum wage went from $1 an hour, 61 to 67, effective February 67 for newly covered non-farm workers, $1.15 in February 1968, and $1.30 in February 1969, $1.45 in February 1970, and $1.60 in February 1971. Increases for newly subject farm workers stopped at $1.30. The 1966 amendments extended the full-time student certification program to covered agricultural employers and institutions of higher learning. So yeah, see how it's like every so often it's like we need to do like a subtle raise. In 1974, Congress included under the Fair Labor Standards Act all no supervisory employees of federal, state, and local governments and many domestic workers. Subsequently, in 1976, in National League of Citizens versus Usury, the Supreme Court held that the minimum wage and overtime provisions of the FLSA could not constitutionally apply to state and local government employees engaged in traditional government functions. The minimum wage increased to $2 an hour in 1974, to $10 in 75, to $30 in 76, for all except farm workers, whose minimum initially rose to $1.60. Parity with non-farm workers was reached at $2.30 with the 1977 amendments. So yeah, look at this. It's growing. Everybody's getting the wages they need. The 1977 amendments, by eliminating the separate lower minimum for large agricultural employees, although retaining the overtime exemption, set a new uniform wage schedule for all covered workers. The minimum went to $2.65 an hour in January of 1978, $2.90 in January 1979, $3.10 in January 1980, and $3.35 in January of 1981. The amendments eased the provisions for establishments permitted to employ students at the lower wage rate and allowed special waivers for children 10 to 11-year-old to work in agriculture. The overtime exemption for employees in hotels, motels, and restaurants was eliminated. To allow for the effects of inflation, the $250,000 volume of sales coverage test for retail, trade, and service enterprises was increased in stages to $362,500 after December 31st, 1981. As a result of the Supreme Court's 1985 decision in Garcia versus San Antonio Metropolitan Transit Authority, Congress passed amendments changing the application of FLSA to public sector employees. Specifically, these amendments permit state and local governments to compensate their employees for overtime hours worked with compensatory time off in lieu of overtime pay at a rate of 1.5 hours for each hour of overtime worked, which is more or less what it is. I know when I last worked, I don't think it changed it since, but still. The 1989 amendments established a single annual dollar volume test of $500,000 for enterprise coverage of both retail and no retail businesses. At the same time, the amendments eliminated the minimum wage and overtime pay exemption for small retail firms. Thus, employees of small retail businesses became subject to minimum wage and overtime pay in any work week in which they engage in commerce or the production of goods for commerce. The minimum wage was raised to $3.80 an hour beginning April 1st, 1990, and to $4.25 an hour beginning April 1st, 1991. The amendments also established a training wage provision at 85% of the minimum wage, but not less than $3.35 an hour. For employees under the age of 20, a provision that expired in 1993. Finally, the amendments established the overtime exception for time spent by employees in remedial education and civil money penalties for willful or repeated violations of minimum wage and overtime pay requirements of the law. In 1990, Congress enacted legislation requiring regulations to be issued providing a special overtime exemption for certain highly skilled professionals in the computer field who did not receive less than 6.5 times the applicable minimum wage. The 1996 amendments increased the wage to $4.75 an hour on October 1st, 1996, and $5.15 an hour on September 1st, 1997. The amendments also established a youth sub-minimum wage of $4.25 an hour for newly hired employees under age 20 during their first 90 consecutive calendar days after being hired by their employer, revised the tip credit provisions to allow employers to pay qualifying tipped employees no less than $2.13 an hour if they receive the remainder of the statutory minimum wage in tips, set the hourly compensation test for qualifying computer-related professional employees at $27.63 an hour, and amended the Portal to Portal Act to allow employers and employees to agree on the use of employer-provided vehicles for commuting to and from work at the beginning and end of every workday without counting the commuting time as compensable working time if certain conditions are met. So yeah, that's when I started working. $5.15 an hour. Though when I started work it was $5.25 or $4.25 an hour because I was under 20, newly hired and stuff. So the 2007 amendments increased the minimum wage to $5.85 an hour, effective July 24, 2007, $6.55 an hour, July 24, 2008, and $7.25 an hour, effective July 24, 2009. Separate provision of the bill brings the phased increases of the minimum wage to Commonwealth of Mariana Islands, American Samoa, with the goal of bringing minimum wages in those locations up to general federal minimum wage over a number of years. But that's where we stopped, because that was the last minimum wage increase after it was so consistent. The late 90s, we got up to $5.15 an hour, and it had been pretty consistent. But then we went for a long spell of a decade, the longest we had, so we could raise it in increments to finally get up to $7.25 an hour, which is what it is now. But we have been even longer since just was the longest time for minimum wage, between minimum wage raises. So I just wanted to kind of point that out. 97, 2007, longest time, decade. But now, if we go by 2009 to now, we are at what? 15, 19, 24, 16 years. 16 years it's been. So yeah, since the 90s we've had one minimum wage raise. This is why people are struggling. Prices continually go up. But we have been stuck at this bullshit lower wage hypocrisy. You know, there was a fight for 15, but it's above 15 now that we need as a minimum wage. And the longer they wait, the higher it's going to go, because we've got to be able to make a living and survive off of it. A decent living. This is the National Employment Law Project. Every job should pay a living wage. Fighting to raise the wage floors so it reaches a true living wage that people and families can actually live on. This 2-3 job bullshit that people are forced to do, bullshit. It needs to go. Need paychecks that sustain people and families. Advocating to raise the minimum wage and expand coverage at the federal, state, and local levels to move the minimum wage closer to a living wage. Make more workers eligible for overtime pay so they are properly paid for the long hours they put in. And let cities and counties set their own higher labor standards, opposing state preemption laws that block cities and counties from adopting higher local minimum wages and other pro-worker policies. Congress needs to raise the federal minimum wage. Yeah. It's time that elected lawmakers in Congress pass the Raise the Wage Act to gradually raise the federal minimum wage to $17 an hour by 2028. And end the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers and disabled workers. Absolutely! Because that's something else I was going to come to. Minimum tipped wage. But yeah, wage by the numbers. $7.25 is our minimum wage per hour. The federal minimum wage hasn't gone up in over 15 years. Like I said, 16 years. 20 states follow the federal minimum wage. They have not raised wages above $7.25. 20. So luckily there's 30 that actually do pay a little higher, though we still need wages up to a level, and smack some of these greedy capitalists, for lack of a better word, down for making prices ridiculously high. $2.13 an hour is the tipped wage for the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. Hasn't changed since even longer, 1991. Which is, I agree, why tipped wages should be a thing of the past. They need to go away. Expand overtime pay rights to more workers. Raise the overtime salary threshold, which is currently at $35,568 a year. The higher the threshold, the more people below it who will qualify for overtime pay. End overtime pay exclusions that block millions of workers, including teachers and farm workers, from getting overtime pay no matter how many hours they work. So yeah. We have a Wikipedia article on the minimum wage, shows states their minimum wages. Some are at the national level, $7.25, $7.25, $7.20. Yeah, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, North Dakota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Wyoming, Utah, and Idaho. They only follow the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. So yeah, Let's see. So no one can go below that. So that means those states are at a bare minimum at the lowest. Other states have higher. A lot of them up to 15. California and Washington are over 16. The highest, though, is Washington, D.C. at $17.50. They talk about the different federal wages, history of it. How it was passed, the New Deal, legislation, state laws, ordinances, Puerto Rico inflation indexing, union exemptions, historical trend. Yeah. The federal minimum wage in nominal dollars, not inflation adjusted, versus the federal minimum wage in 2024 dollars. So, yes, it goes up to 515, 725. This is what the nominal dollars mean. But if you compare them to what they are equivalent to 2024, yeah, let's look at this. A peak in the early 70s, falls these are the 80s, and then there's this great fall, boom, bottoming out here in the mid 90s. Goes up, pause, down, pause, up, pause, and then we start the downslide with W, that huge downslide. So we've got what here? Reagan, George W. A lot of their policies did not do good for the American worker. Now, Obama caused wages to jump, the value of wages. And since then, they've only been on that downward trend. So, we're essentially back down to $7.25 being equivalent to $7.25, even though the cost of things have went up much higher. We haven't gotten the raises in the minimum wage, like I stated. U.S. federal minimum wage, if it had kept pace with productivity, which is the top line. I'm sure y'all probably seen this. It's been put out there several times. And this is the real minimum wage, inflation adjusted to 2023 dollars. So we're at $7.25, though if it had kept up with production, we'd be at $25.52. So yeah, honestly, we should have a minimum wage over $20. But do we? Fuck no. Let's see. Let's see what else we got here. Conceptually, raising the minimum wage increases the cost of labor, with all other things being equal. Thus, employers may accept some combination of lower profits, higher prices, or increased automation. If prices increase, consumers may demand a lesser quantity of the product, substitute other products, or switch to imported products due to their effects on the price elasticity of demand. But here's the thing. We've seen the executives, the heads at corporations just get richer and richer, while the average American is forced into the depths of not being able to afford things. Marginal producers, those who are barely profitable enough to survive, may be forced out of business if they cannot raise their prices sufficiently to offset the higher cost of labor, which is why I believe smaller companies below a certain amount should get some assistance by the government to help them sustain themselves, help them exist. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago research from 2007 has shown that restaurant prices rise in response to minimum wage increases. However, there are studies that show that higher prices or products due to increased labor costs are usually only by about 0.4% of the original price. So yeah. .4. That's not 1%. That's not 4%. Yeah. That is minuscule. 1% of a dollar is 1 penny. To give you a bit of a look at that, so 0.4 doesn't even equal a whole penny per dollar. This shows just the pure greed of these executives and business owners. These corporate greedy bastards they are. Anyway, effects on suicide. Between 1990 and 2015, raising the minimum wage by $1 in each state might have saved more than 27,000 lives, according to a report published in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health. An increase of $2 in each state's minimum wage could have prevented more than 57,000 suicides. The researchers stated the effect of $1 US increase to the minimum wage ranged from 3.4% decrease to 5.9% decrease in the suicide rate among adults aged 18 to 64, typical working age, with a high school education or less. We detected significant effect modification by unemployment rate, with the largest effects of minimum wage on reducing suicides observed at higher unemployment levels. they concluded minimum wage increases appear to reduce the suicide rate among those with a high school education or less and may reduce disparities between socioeconomic groups. So yeah, I mean, it's common sense. If you're not struggling day to day to survive, you feel a little more at ease. You're not worried, you're not under all this pressure. But yeah. Income inequality. For developed countries in 2016. Minimum wage levels in developed economies as a share of median full-time wage. The relative minimum wage ratio in the U.S. is shown in red. So, I think what they're trying to show here is how much the minimum wage is equal to the median wage, which is one of the ways to measure in the center is median. I ain't took statistics on so long I can't remember how it's chosen, but anyway, 0.61 the amount of the median, for instance, minimum is. I'll look down here, US only 0.35 of its minimum, or its minimum wage is only equal to 0.35 of the median. And like I said, it's just one way to learn how what the middle ground is. Not the only way to measure middle ground, but yeah. So, yeah, U.S. inequality with wealth, pretty fucking bad. In 2021, the Congressional Budget Office released a report which estimated that incrementally raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025 should increase the federal budget deficit, would increase it by $54 billion over 10 years by increasing the cost of goods and services paid for by the federal government. But yeah. Anyway, just wanted to talk a bit about how they are kind of screwing over the American people with minimum wages. It should not be like it is. That's everything, looks like. And then I had some stuff on minimum wages for tipped employees. State requires employers to pay a tipped employees full state minimum wage before tips. There are a handful of them. Alaska, California, Guam, U.S. territory, Minnesota, and Montana. And then they've got some variations. Nevada, Oregon. The Oregon minimum wage varies by region. Washington state requires employers to pay tipped employees a minimum cash wage above the minimum cash wage required by the FLSA. And this again, Arizona, Arkansas, Colorado, Connecticut. But yeah, honestly, this just needs to end. Nobody should have to subsist on tips, which, from what I understand, some of those who get tips, like waitresses, they have to share the tips to help pay out some of the other workers. And so they're still not getting what should equate to their own. But yeah, end tipped wage. Just pay them a fucking minimum wage. There's a lot of people who don't like to tip, but this at least would make sure people could still make a living at a job without having to depend on the kindness of others. I mean, this is common sense stuff, but kind of wanted to break through on a video with dealing with wages and pay. But we'll go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll be putting my links and sources in the description box below the video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.